There comes a point in identity evolution when the question shifts. It's no longer who am I? It's not even do I belong? The question that surfaces quietly and persistently is this: can I let other people see who I'm actually becoming? Welcome back to your Passion, Purpose, and Personal Brand. I'm Lisa McGuire, Strategic Identity Advisor. If you've been following this series, you know we've been moving through what I think of as the embodiment arc. We started with recognition, which is naming the feeling that once fit no longer does, and then understanding what it means to be successfully stuck. We then moved into reflection, the loneliness beneath the performance, and then the realization that the future belongs to the people who know themselves. And over the last 2 episodes, we looked at worthiness and belonging, the fear of not being enough, and the fear that becoming fully yourself might cost you your place. If you've been listening closely, another question has likely been forming underneath both of those. It may sound something like this: is it safe to let people see the truth of who I'm becoming? Because knowing who you are privately and allowing that truth to become visibly public, those are 2 very different things. Today, we're talking about visibility, reluctance, and imposter syndrome. And I want to say right at the start that I have a complicated relationship with that phrase, because I don't believe most people are experiencing it are imposters. I think they are becoming. And becoming is vulnerable. Becoming asks us to inhabit identities we've never occupied before. It asks us to be visible before we feel ready. And I think that's exactly where most people get stuck. Before we go any further, today's episode is sponsored by Successfully Stuck, the First Truth Kit. Because sometimes what you're experiencing isn't a lack of confidence, it isn't procrastination, and it isn't that you need one more certification before you begin. Sometimes you're standing at the edge of identity expansion, and what you need isn't a push. It's clarity about what's actually happening beneath the surface. The First Truth Kit includes a private diagnostic, reflection prompts, the identity evolution map, and a guided audio from me. You'll find the link to it in the show notes. So here's what I've come to believe about visibility. We've been taught to treat it as a tactical problem. We say things like, I need a better content strategy. I need to post more consistently. I need to get over my fear of public speaking. And while those things may be true in some context, I think visibility is rarely a marketing problem. Visibility is almost always an identity safety problem because being visible asks something of us. It asks us to risk being misunderstood, to risk disappointing people, to risk criticism, to risk outgrowing the version of ourselves that everyone has become comfortable with. Many people say they want to be visible, but what they're actually hoping for is recognition. Recognition without vulnerability. They want to be chosen without the risk of rejection, respected without inviting criticism, seen without ever having to feel seen. But that isn't how visibility works. Visibility requires exposure. And exposure can feel terrifying, especially if you spent years building an identity around competence, around having the answers, around making sure everyone else is comfortable. I want to share something personal. When I launched this podcast more than 5 seasons ago, I wanted to go big. That probably doesn't surprise you. But I didn't start by asking who would it be safe to interview. No, I started by asking who represents the kind of conversations I want this podcast to hold. And then I did something that could have activated every ounce of imposter syndrome I had. I reached out to some of the most celebrated people in their industries, people who have been interviewed hundreds, if not thousands of times, people with established platforms and established credibility. And I invited them to be guests on a podcast that did not exist yet. I hadn't recorded an episode, not one. I had no download statistics, no testimonials, and no polished process. I barely knew what I was doing. I just knew why I wanted to do it. And one by one, they said yes. My first 3 guests were people who had every reason to decline. One of them agreed to be my very first episode. And I've thought about that many times over the years, because it is genuinely risky to lend your reputation to something unproven. He did it anyway, and I've never forgotten that generosity. Now, could I have talked myself out of reaching out to them? Oh, absolutely. I could have asked myself, who am I to do this? What if they say no? What if I embarrass myself? What if they realize I don't really know what I'm doing? And honestly, I didn't feel fully confident when it came time to interview them. There was nervousness and self-doubt. There was the voice that whispered, what if you mess this up? But something else was stronger. The why behind the podcast. The conversations that I wanted each of you to hear. The impact I'd hoped they have. The vision of what this could become. It wasn't really about me. It was about service, about contribution, about creating something that did not exist yet. When the purpose becomes bigger than the protection, we often discover the courage we didn't know we had. During one of those early interviews, I made a mistake. After the recording was over and the episode started processing, the guest, who was incredibly kind, gently pointed it out. I remember the embarrassment. I remember replaying it. And I remember wishing I could go back and do it differently. But I also remember what happened next. I kept going. I recorded the next episode and the next. What I learned wasn't that visibility means getting everything right. I learned that visibility means remaining visible even after you've gotten something wrong. Mistakes don't disqualify us. They refine us. Now, more than 230 episodes later, I can hear the evolution in my own voice. And if you go back and listen to season 1, you will notice the difference. I am more direct now, more trusting of what I see, less interested in being universally liked, and more willing to let people decide whether or not they agree. And I'm less inclined to soften the truth so everyone stays comfortable. That version of me did not arrive before I started. She emerged because I started. Episode by episode, conversation by conversation, visible long enough before she felt fully ready. So maybe that's what imposter syndrome actually is. Not evidence that you're a fraud, not proof that you're unqualified, but the experience of inhabiting an identity larger than the one you've historically allowed yourself to occupy. Maybe what you're feeling isn't inadequacy. Maybe it's expansion. And maybe the invitation isn't to eliminate fear before you move. It's to trust that confidence can be built on the other side of courageous expression. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, Lisa, but what if I really don't know enough? That's a fair question. And of course, there are times when we genuinely need more skill and more experience. Growth matters. So does preparation. Integrity matters. But that's not who I'm talking to right now. I'm talking to the person who already has evidence, the person whose clients get results, the person whose wisdom was earned through lived experience, not a classroom, the person who still hears the voice asking, who do you think you are? What if someone asks you a question you can't answer? What if they realize you're making this up as you go? Here's something I believe. Many people who appear highly confident are simply more practiced at being visible. Not because they never doubted themselves, but because they kept showing up anyway. And every time they did, they gathered evidence. Evidence that they could survive being seen, survive making mistakes, and survive disappointing someone. survive being misunderstood. All of those. Over time, that evidence became trust. That distinction matters because trust is different than certainty. Confidence isn't certainty. Confidence is self-trust. It's the ability to say, I don't know exactly how this will go, but I trust myself to handle whatever happens. This reminds me of something Dan Sullivan teaches, the 4 C's: commitment, courage, capability, and confidence. What strikes me about this framework is that confidence comes last, not first, because somewhere along the way we've been taught that confidence should precede action. That if we just wait long enough, prepare long enough, learn enough, one day we'll wake up feeling ready. That isn't how it works. Commitment comes first. The decision, the desire, the knowing something matters. Then courage, the willingness to act before certainty arrives. Capability develops through experience, and confidence grows because you've gathered evidence that you can do hard things. There's an identity version of this too. You recognize who you're becoming. You choose courage and allow yourself to be seen. You develop the capacity to carry that visibility, and eventually you trust yourself. But for most people, they stop in the middle. They mistake the discomfort of courage for a signal to stop. Nervousness is interpreted as a stop sign. They assume that because something feels vulnerable, it must be wrong. But what if it isn't wrong? What if it's simply unfamiliar? Visibility reluctance doesn't always look like hiding. Sometimes it looks responsible. Sometimes it sounds wise. It says, I just need to refine my message first. I need my website finished before I put myself out there. I'll start once I feel more confident. I don't want to overstate my expertise. And while some of those things may have a kernel of truth, they can also become sophisticated forms of self-protection. Because if you never fully step forward, you never fully risk being seen. I think this is especially true for women. Many of us were taught to be accomplished but not intimidating, capable but not threatening, confident but not too confident. So we learn to calibrate ourselves, to take up just enough space, to share the idea but soften the certainty, to contribute without overshadowing, and to shine, but not too brightly. And eventually, it becomes genuinely difficult to know, am I being humble or am I hiding? That question matters because humility and hiding are not the same thing. Humility says, I don't know everything, and it leaves room for growth. Hiding says, because I don't know everything, I shouldn't speak at all, and postpones expression indefinitely. The world loses something when that happens because there are people waiting for what only you can articulate. Your perspective, your lived experience, and your way of seeing, your category of only. This is why category of only matters so much. It isn't about becoming louder. It's about becoming unmistakable, not performing expertise, but recognizing the perspective your life has uniquely built. And the clearer you become about who you are, the less energy you spend trying to be everyone else. Clarity reduces the need for performance. You stop chasing approval. You stop shape-shifting for every room. You stop trying to fit inside categories that were never designed to hold your complexity. Instead, you begin to trust what you see, and that trust changes the way you show up. One of the most courageous things we can do is stop editing ourselves into invisibility, not becoming reckless, and not oversharing. It's not making ourselves responsible for everyone else's emotional experience. Simply telling the truth, allowing our voice to take up space, saying the thing we know needs to be said, even if our hands shake a little while we're saying it. Because visibility isn't about fearlessness. It's about devotion. Devotion to the message, to the contribution, to the people who need what you've learned, to the version of you that no longer wants to hide. So I want to leave you with a question. Not a checklist of places you've been playing small, but one real question to sit with. What truth have you been editing out of your life because you're not sure how it will be received? Where have you mistaken self-protection for wisdom? Where have you confused hiding with humility? Where are you waiting to feel completely ready before you let yourself be known? Because if the last 5 seasons of this podcast have taught me anything, it's that readiness rarely arrives first. The first episode, the first speech, the first offer, the first boundary, the first time I trusted my own perspective over the consensus in the room, I wasn't ready for any of it. I was willing, and willingness changed me. So perhaps the invitation isn't to eliminate imposter syndrome. Perhaps it's to get curious about it, to ask, what part of me still believes I have to be perfect before I can be visible? What would become possible if I stopped waiting for certainty and started trusting what I've already built? Because the goal isn't fearlessness. The goal is becoming more committed to truth than to protection. It's about being more committed to contribution than to performance, and more committed to expression than to perfection. If you're listening to this thinking, but I still feel afraid, I want you to hear this. Listen closely. Fear does not disqualify you, and fear isn't evidence that you should stop. Fear often accompanies exactly the kind of growth that asks us to inhabit identities we've never occupied before. You don't need to eradicate fear. You need to build trust. Trust in your capacity, in your resilience. Trust that you can survive being misunderstood, recover from mistakes, and that your voice doesn't need to sound like anyone else's to matter. Trust that what you've lived has prepared you in a way credentials never could. And trust that the people meant for your work don't need a polished performance. They need your presence and your honesty, your perspective, the version of you that has stopped editing themselves into invisibility. Because every day you stay hidden, someone waiting is looking for you, and they have to wait a little longer for the words that only you can say. Next time, we're going to explore another force that pulls us backward even after we've committed to growth, and those are patterns. Because awareness alone doesn't create transformation. The coping mechanisms that once protected us don't disappear simply because we've outgrown them. We'll talk about perfectionism, overfunctioning, hyper-independence, and the patterns that quietly shape our lives long after they've stopped serving us. But for now, I want you to remember this. The version of you you're becoming doesn't need to arrive fully confident. She simply seems to keep showing up, visible, willing, and truthful. You don't need to become someone else to be seen. You simply have to stop hiding the person you've already become. Thanks for joining me here today. I'll see you here next time.